Monday, October 30th, 1967, was a normal day for two young girls who had returned from school and gone up to a bedroom to play. A while later, while peering from one of the upstairs windows, they saw what they would later recount appeared to them a waxy mannequin lying in a car parked on the street below. Curious, they went outside to investigate, but when they got closer, to their horror, they realized it was a woman lying naked in the backseat of the car. I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is New York's Dark Side. I'm back again with what is the final installment of our coverage of Richard Cottingham. Unless he decides to provide any more confessions before he is no longer in this realm. But I'm not sure how likely that is to happen. Maybe. Who knows? I'm running out of cute puppy and kitten videos to cheer me up after talking about all this darkness. So if you're just joining the show, this is our third episode on Richard Cottingham, and you probably want to listen to the two episodes before this one because we've covered quite a bit on him and will likely refer to some information we've already discussed as we go into today's content. We left off with Richard Cottingham having been sentenced to more than 200 years in prison for the murder of 5 women: Mary Ann Jean Rayner, Valerie Street, Mary Ann Carr, Dita Goodarzi, and a Jane Doe who, as of this recording in 2024, has yet to be identified, as well as the assault and attempted murder of Leslie Ann Odell and assault of Karen Schilt and Susan Geiger. Cottingham, until this point, had maintained his innocence and was not forthcoming with giving any information to investigators, even though they were sure he likely had more victims. In their book, Serial Violence, Analysis of Modus Operandi and Signature Characteristics of Killers, Robert Keppel and William Burns would describe Richard Cottingham as a torture killer, stating, quote, Richard Cottingham belonged to a subgroup of sexually sadistic serial killers who try to satisfy their self-consuming need for sexual arousal through torturing their victims. The victim's pain and terror are stimulus to the killer, driving him to a greater frenzy that only serves to intensify the level of the victim's torture until the killer's lust is momentarily satisfied. To get to this level of sexual gratification, torture killers are most adept at luring victims, capturing them and springing their traps. Most are smooth talkers and beguilingly charming, but deceitful and ultimately lethal. Torture killers use all sorts of conventional and innovative approaches to con their victims into a false feeling of safety. They flatter and flirt, offering rewards, especially money, hold out the promise of satisfying exactly what they perceive the victim wants, and speaking directly to the victim's needs. It's all a ruse, made to look innocent to trick a potential victim into stepping into the killer's world, end quote. This perfectly describes what we have seen so far with Richard Cottingham. He lured women, particularly vulnerable women, such as sex workers, by offering them something they needed, money. He would flash huge wads of cash at them as a bribe. He bragged about this to his coworkers. He was always clean, well-dressed, and non-threatening looking. He would offer them food and drinks, engaging with them to get them to tell him about their lives, and would provide them with information about his as well. Some of it was truth, some of it was lies. He could exaggerate at times to make himself seem vulnerable. And once he started to gain a level of trust with them, he would drug them and act as a caring gentleman who offered to get them home safely. He did that with both Karen Schilt and Susan Geiger. Once they were completely susceptible to his trap under the drugs, he would drive them to his comfort zone and engage in torture and sometimes murder. It would take over 20 years in prison before, after a lot of time, patience, and coaxing, more information started to be drawn from Cottingham about past victims. This is thanks to the hard work of Bergen County Detective Robert Anzalotti, as well as the daughter of Dita Goodarzi, one of Richard Cottingham's victims, named Jennifer Weiss, and a forensic historian and author named Peter Vronsky. Detective Robert Anzalotti had been given a total of 12 cold cases from Bergen County to investigate. The youngest of these women was 13. The oldest was 29. He would detail the work that he did with Richard Cottingham in the docuseries The Torso Killer Confessions. Most of these 12 women had either been seen hitchhiking or being picked up by a stranger before later being dumped around Bergen County. Detective Anzalotti had built up a relationship with an inmate, Richard Kuklinski, also known as the Iceman, a serial killer in New Jersey who claimed to have murdered anywhere from 100 to 200 men, though he was only convicted of 5 murders. Kuklinski was incarcerated at Trenton State Prison, the same prison as Richard Cottingham. Kuklinski would sometimes act as an informant to Detective Anzalotti. So Anzalotti asked Kuklinski if he could get him some dirt on Richard Cottingham. Kuklinski agreed, telling him that he hated Cottingham because even though he was also a murderer with potentially more victims than Richard Cottingham, he had never hurt women. Kuklinski would come back to Anzalotti with some information that Cottingham was running an illegal gambling ring out of his cell. So Anzalotti used this as a way to gain the upper hand on Cottingham. He had his cell raided the morning after the Super Bowl in 2003, and when evidence was found of the illegal gambling activity, Cottingham was thrown in solitary confinement. After leaving him there for several days, Anzalotti had him brought to an interrogation room and let him know that he was the reason that Cottingham had ended up there, and he could put him back in there if he needed to. The power play gave Anzalotti a bit of respect in Cottingham's eyes, and while he wasn't immediately forthcoming with information, telling Anzalotti that he was trying to keep things out of the paper for his kids, I mean, let's be real here. If he was really worried about protecting his children, he wouldn't have killed anyone. But I digress. Cottingham and Anzalotti started to spend time together, talking and building trust with each other. Initially, they started out the conversations discussing the crimes that Cottingham had already been convicted for and was currently serving time. Cottingham would tell Anzalotti that he would purposely change his modus operandi to throw off investigators to help keep them off his tail. And that's why some of the crimes were so different. By 2006, Cottingham finally started to cooperate and gave some information regarding a murder from October of 1967. This was the murder of a young housewife named Nancy Vogel. Richard Cottingham lived in the same neighborhood as Nancy in Little Ferry, New Jersey, and they knew one another. On October 27, 1967, Nancy had plans to play bingo at St. Margaret's Roman Catholic Church with a friend, but she never showed. Nancy was married. She had been married to her husband Henry for 9 years, and they had 2 young children. Henry reported Nancy missing the following morning after she didn't arrive home. Police initially found nothing amiss. It wasn't until a few days later, on October 30th, when 2 12-year-old girls saw what they thought was a waxy mannequin from a window in their home in the back of a parked car that the truth of what happened to Nancy came out. The girls alerted a neighbor to their discovery and police were summoned. It would take over 4 years for Detective Anzalotti to get a full confession from Richard Cottingham as to what he had done to Nancy Vogel. Cottingham said that he had run into Nancy at the Valley Fair shopping center. They made some small talk and he asked her out to drinks, which she agreed to. So then they left the shopping center and went to the Holiday Inn across the street from the food mart. Nancy offered Cottingham a ride, which he accepted. After a couple of drinks, they went to northern New Jersey to Montvale, to a wooded area behind a cornfield, where Cottingham said he, quote, forced consensual sex on her, then smothered her by holding his hand over her mouth and nose. I am sure everybody listening to this knows there is no such thing as forced consensual sex. That is rape. Once Nancy was gone, he drove her 1960 4-door Rambler to where it was found by the two girls a few days later. Nancy was left naked, her clothes neatly folded beneath her, which is like a random thing that he seems to do. She had been beaten, and her hands were left bound in front of her with a thin nylon cord. In the trunk were a couple of purchases she had made while shopping. Cottingham would describe these purchases to investigators as he made this confession. After getting this confession, the task turned to letting Nancy's remaining family know what they had learned. Nancy had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who were informed of Cottingham's confession, but detectives asked them not to say anything publicly yet, as Anzalotti and his team of investigators were hoping to get additional confessions from Cottingham. They were concerned that Cottingham would stop talking if news broke publicly, as he had been threatening to do. Cottingham was offered a plea deal, life in prison without possibility of parole, for pleading guilty to the murder of Nancy Vogel. This really wouldn't change anything for him in the long run, since he was already serving multiple life sentences for his previous convictions. Cottingham agreed to the plea deal, and they set up a court date for August 2010, requesting it be late in the day to try to adhere to a quick, quiet, no fanfare trial. The judge, however, forced Cottingham to apologize to Nancy Vogel's children. After the trial, Cottingham shut down and told Anzalotti that he was not going to participate in anything like that ever again. 3 weeks after the court date, a paper ran a story on the new conviction. Cottingham would become upset, telling Anzalotti that he didn't want the notoriety of being a killer. To which I say, then don't kill people. This would be the first closing of one of those cold case files Anzalotti had started out with. After this hiccup, investigators decided to switch tactics and this time offered Cottingham something called exceptional clearance, which means that if a confession was corroborated by evidence and witness statements and believed to be an actual honest confession, they could tell the family that the case was solved and close it. This is usually a tough balancing act to do, but Cottingham, again, is already serving multiple life sentences for previous convictions. So taking him to court and, charging him with more life sentences isn't going to change anything in the long run for him. As they continue their conversations with Richard Cottingham, he tells them that he was watching the show Roswell, and there was an actress named Cherie Appleby that reminded him of one of his victims. Anzalotti recalled one of those cold case files had a young girl that had disappeared from a bus stop that bore a resemblance to the actress. So this might actually be something viable. 18-year-old Irene Blaze went missing on April 7th, 1969. She was last seen at a bus stop speaking to a man who, during their conversation, was tugging on his right ear frequently. This was noticed by another person at the bus stop. Irene's body would be found the following day in the Saddlebrook River. Robert Anzalotti had a personal connection to this case. His cousin Richard Cottingham was Irene's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. Richard and Irene had gotten into an argument at a club at some point before she went missing, and that was the last time Richard had seen her. Richard was heavily looked into as a suspect in her death, which would impact the rest of his life. Irene's mother believed him to be the one who committed the murder, so he wasn't even allowed to attend her funeral. On June 20th, 2014, Cottingham formally confessed to the death of Irene Blaze. He would state that he had noticed her shopping at a Sears department store and decided to follow her. For the next 15 to 20 minutes, he tracked her as she window shopped down Main Street. Once she got to the bus stop, he approached her, talked to her, and offered her a drink, which she accepted. He called a cab and took her to Little Ferry, New Jersey, where they had drinks at the Holiday Inn. He told investigators that he had chosen the Holiday Inn because he went there regularly. He went there with Nancy Vogel 2 years earlier, and he had actually parked his car there. He then took Irene to a place on Essex Street for pizza because he started to get worried about being recognized by someone at the hotel. After they had pizza, he launched his attack. He tied her up with the scarf that she had just purchased at Sears. He made a similar claim as he had with Nancy Vogel, stating that he never forced sex on women. He just told them that they were going to have sex, and that was that. That's forcing sex. It makes me so angry. Cottingham would describe poking at Irene with a knife for fun, making shallow cuts and stabs, and he would do this to get the women to comply with what he wanted. Again, force. I hate how killers sometimes want... Well, it's not even just killers. I hate how sometimes criminals... Yeah, I guess we'll go with criminals. I hate how sometimes criminals try to downplay what they do to people. They can't take accountability for their actions. Anyway, once Cottingham had his fill of Irene, he strangled her with her stockings. In December of 2014, Anzalotti was able to bring closure to his cousin Richard and to Irene's family by telling them what he had learned about the case. This closed a second cold case file for Anzalotti. Continuing their work, Anzalotti's investigative team was able to get another confession from Cottingham, this time for the murder of 15-year-old Denise Velasca. Denise was going into her sophomore year at Northern Valley High School, where she played field hockey and basketball. She was a member of Kloster's Drum and Fife Corps. She, just like all the other women this monster of a man took from the world far too early, had her whole life ahead of her. On July 14, 1969, Cottingham would come across Denise walking along a road. She was on her way to meet her boyfriend. Anzalotti would speak about this confession, saying that at times his work with Cottingham would impact his life at home. He had daughters of his own, and it was really hard for him to sit and listen to Cottingham talk about the horrible things he had done. And this was a case that especially bothered Anzalotti. Cottingham confessed to pulling up to Denise and offering her a ride to meet her friends, which she accepted. Trigger warning here. He instead took her to a parking lot of St. Andrew's School, where he had gone to school as a child, and forced her to perform oral sex on him. He then made a statement about her not being very good at. It's fucking heartbreaking to hear this. Cottingham said he then drove her to Saddlebrook, where he strangled her with the crucifix necklace that she was wearing and left her. He then drove to New York City to get something to eat. He told investigators that it was like someone other than himself was doing it, but I don't buy that at all. I think this is just his narcissistic asshole tendency to downplay what he did and not take accountability for his own actions. Denise's body was found the next day by a 12-year-old boy riding his bicycle. The boy went home and alerted his parents, who called police. This closed the third cold case of Anzalotti's, the second through exceptional clearance. The family was again asked not to speak publicly about learning the truth of what had happened to Denise. Next, Richard Cottingham looked at some photos and pointed out a girl that he said reminded him of a victim he had named Helmet Head because of her short, bowl cut haircut. This was 13-year-old Jacqueline Harp. On July 17, 1968, Jacqueline had just finished band practice. She was the flag holder with her school's band. She was walking home when Richard Cottingham noticed her from where he was sitting in a root beer joint. He told investigators that he took notice of her because she didn't have any socks on and had been wearing low shoes. She'd been wearing moccasins that day. He gave his formal confession to her murder on June 1st, 2017, almost 50 years later. He told investigators that he had offered her a ride home, which she refused, so instead he decided to follow her. Jacqueline noticed him following her, so she actually turned back towards town to try to throw him off her trail. He took his chance and grabbed her, pulling her into an alley where he tried to rape her, but he panicked when she started to scream, so he strangled her with her flag belt that she had been carrying home. Her family became frantic when Jacqueline didn't come home and started to search for her. Jacqueline's sister would recall on the A&E documentary, The Torso Killer Confessions, that they had actually passed by the alley where she was found when they were looking for her. It was a half a mile from their home, but they hadn't gone down it. Investigators were trying hard to keep their agreement to keep the 3 confessions from the media, but it didn't work out. As it turned out, Richard Cottingham was actually working with an author named Peter Vronsky, who was writing a book on his life. And this is where Jennifer Weiss and Peter Vronsky come into play in the Richard Cottingham confessions. In an article by Rodrigo Torrejon on NewJersey.com, in 2017, Jennifer Weiss would write her first letter to Richard Cottingham, asking her 2 most burning questions. Did you know my mother, and where did you hide her head? Jennifer is the daughter of Cottingham's victim, Dita Goodarzi, who was one of the 2 torsos that was found in the Travel Inn Motor Lodge in New York City by firefighters who had been called to the hotel room fire. Jennifer would describe putting a bunch of emoji stickers on the first letter and trying to approach Cottingham with kindness to get the answers that she desperately wanted from him. Jennifer would also ask Cottingham to add her to the list of people that could visit him. After a month, she got a response from him with an apology, and 2 months later, he did add her to his visitation list. Cottingham would write to Jennifer, quote, I just don't know what to say to you or how to say it. I can only tell you what's in my heart and pray that you believe me. I am truly and deeply sorry, so very sorry for all the pain I have brought into your life, end quote. Cottingham would eventually tell Jennifer that he had buried Dita Goodarzi's head at the base of the George Washington Bridge. Even though there's been extensive searches for it, to this day, it has not been found. He would also tell Jennifer that he had known her mother. He had been one of her clients for 2 years before he ended her life in such a grotesque fashion, and that he had done it because he didn't care about people or society around him. Jennifer talks about finding out the truth regarding her mother's death and her relationship with Richard Cottingham on the true crime docuseries Crime Scene: The Times Square Killer on Netflix. According to an article by Breen Elric, Robert Ancelotti, Jennifer Weiss, and Peter Vronsky would start to communicate with each other in 2017. Jennifer had reached out to Bergen County law enforcement after Cottingham had told her the location of her mother's head. She would also befriend Peter Vronsky, and they found out about the 3 confessions Richard Cottingham had made through connecting with a network of victims' family and friends that were upset about not being able to publicly discuss the murders. And this article brings up an important point that within the community, if there are innocent people that community members believe committed the crime, then they're living with the burden of suspicion. And I think we see a lot of how difficult that can be, especially in the days of social media with all the keyboard warriors out there that, say a lot of things they probably wouldn't say to people's faces. It can truly ruin somebody's life when they are, in the spotlight, and especially if they're wrongly in the spotlight for something. Peter Vronsky would speak with Detective Ancelotti and get his permission to write about the confessions in his book that he was working on with Richard Cottingham. The title of the book was Serial Killers: The Method and Madness of Monsters. But then Vronsky would hold a press conference in Midland Park, New Jersey at a library in December of 2019, and he would announce publicly that Richard Cottingham had committed the murders. Ancelotti feared that Cottingham would stop giving information after that, but he actually didn't. Peter Vronsky would tell Rolling Stone he believes this is because of Cottingham's relationship with Jennifer, stating, quote, Jennifer is strangely sort of a vessel or vehicle for his confessions, the daughter of one of his many victims through whom he atones for the murders of others. Confessions through her were now what Cottingham had settled on as his price, end quote. Cottingham would next confess to the murder of 2 more teenage girls, but there is some disagreement regarding how exactly these confessions came about. Ancelotti would say in the A&E docuseries The Torso Killer Confessions that he decided to retire in March of 2021 and wanted to use his retirement as leverage to gain more confessions. Vronsky told Rolling Stone that Cottingham told him that he would confess to a series of 16 murders around New York and New Jersey as a favor to him for writing his book if he could make the confessions on camera with Jennifer Weiss in the room. Vronsky states that Ancelotti initially was intrigued by the idea but then backed away from it. Ancelotti told Rolling Stone that he was never on board with the idea as, quote, "that's not how law enforcement takes a confession," end quote. Richard Cottingham would also speak with Rolling Stone about this and said that he had been close with making the arrangement with Ancelotti for the confession, but they weren't able to come up with a favorable agreement to all parties, whatever that means. Jennifer helped with that in that Cottingham felt he needed to please her with how important the confessions were to her, but he had also done it for Ancelotti because of the years that he had put in to convince him to do the right thing. So regardless, overall, what matters more than who got Cottingham to confess to the next murders is the fact that he did confess and was able to give closure to 2 more families who had been left with so many emotions and questions after losing their loved ones so young. On August 9th, 1974, 16-year-old Lorraine Kelly and 17-year-old Mary Ann Pryor were 2 best friends with plans to go to the mall together to buy a bathing suit for an upcoming vacation to the Jersey Shore. The girls were hitchhiking to the mall when Richard Cottingham drove past them on his way to work. He stopped and offered them a ride. A few witnesses would later report seeing the girls get into a car with a white man. According to Cottingham, it started to rain by the time they got close to the mall, so that in his mind was what sealed their fate. Instead of dropping them off at the mall, he drove them to a hotel where he put Lorraine in a headlock and threatened to hurt her to Mary Ann to get them to go inside. He said that they watched TV for a while on the bed and they were laughing and joking, which I don't personally believe. Cottingham would sexually assault both girls over the next 2 days that he had them at the hotel. He told investigators that at night he would hog-tie them so that he could get some sleep without fear of them running away. When he was done, he drowned both girls in the bathtub, first Lorraine and then Mary Ann. The family would discuss that when they reported the girls missing, they were initially told by police that the girls had run away and that the report wasn't really taken seriously. Unfortunately, the girls were found in a wooded area in Montvale a few days later. The family first heard about the bodies being found on the radio moments before investigators arrived to ask them to come do an identification. Richard Cottingham would formally confess on April 14, 2021 to the murders and received 2 more life sentences. I'm honestly lost count of where we are now with life sentences, but we're still not done. Robert Ancelotti retired in May of 2021, and the community held a huge retirement celebration for him, but he's continued to correspond with Richard Cottingham with the hope of getting more confessions from him. In August of 2022, investigators offered Richard Cottingham a non-prosecution agreement and received a confession for him for the murder of Lorraine McGraw. Hikers had found her body on March 1st, 1970, off of Tweed Boulevard in South Nyack. Like Jennifer Weiss, Lorraine's granddaughter was searching for the truth to what had happened to her grandma. She believed for years that Richard Cottingham had something to do with it, so she wrote to him. She told Pix 11's Mary Murphy that while Cottingham never directly had said to her that he killed her grandmother, he did tell her that he knew what had happened to her. Lorraine McGraw was working as a sex worker when she encountered Richard Cottingham. Like so many others, she was beaten and strangled and left to be found, this time on the side of a hiking trail. Another confession that investigators were able to get from Richard Cottingham was for the murder of Diane Cusick, a 23-year-old mother of 1 who was working as a dance teacher. On February 15th, Diane told her parents that she was going to the mall to buy shoes. She was found in her car after having been beaten, raped, and strangled in the parking lot of Valley Stream's Green Acres Mall by her parents on February 16th. I can't imagine being a parent and finding your child that way, because I know she's an adult, but that's your baby. They're always your baby. Investigators would say that they believed Cottingham may have pretended to either be a security guard or a police officer to gain Diane's trust in going with him to her car. With Diane's case, investigators had DNA evidence, which was how they were able to connect Cottingham to her murder 54 years later. Another victim that Cottingham would confess to was the murder of 21-year-old Mary Beth Hines, who disappeared on May 5th, 1972. Her body was found strangled face down in a muddy creek in Rockville Center. 2 months later, 23-year-old Laverne Moy, a mother of two, was found on July 20th, 1972, also strangled to death in the same area. Richard Cottingham would confess to her murder as well. Sheila Hyman, age 33, was found by her husband in the bathroom of their North Woodmere home. Sheila had been beaten to death on July 20th, 1973. She was a married mother whose children were away at summer camp, and her husband had been out shopping when she was attacked by Richard Cottingham. Sheila's husband was long suspected to be her killer. He would unfortunately pass away in 2004, long before the truth came to light in the public's eye. Sheila's daughter, Randy, would say to reporters of her father that, quote, "He was a kind and generous man who loved our mother deeply and who spent too many years living in the shadow of his wife's murder. There's no reason why he should have been suspected. My poor dad lived with that every day until he died," end quote. Marita Rosado Nieves was 18 years old and from Puerto Rico. She was found after having been strangled on or about December 27, 1973, on Jones Beach. Park employees out doing maintenance found her in a weeded area covered in plastic bags and wrapped in a gray blanket. Police had been looking for her family, and I'm not sure if they ever came in contact with them. I didn't find it in the source material. For the last string of confessions that we just talked about, the assistant district attorney asked Cottingham to ask forgiveness of the families, and he would not. He refused. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for the murder of Diane Cusick in exchange for non-prosecution for the confessions of the other 4 murders as part of a plea deal. Richard Cottingham would also confess to the murder of Mary Ann Della Sala, a 17-year-old who had disappeared in January of 1967 after finishing her shift at the ShopRite where she worked part-time on Essex Street in Hackensack, New Jersey. Cottingham had taken a liking to her and had been watching her for a while. It was a nice night that night, and Mary Ann had been offered a ride home by a coworker, but she opted to walk instead. Her body was discovered 3 months later in the Passaic River. Her murder was unsolved until March of 2022, when Detective Anzalotti coaxed a confession from him. Mary Ann had been a senior at Hackensack High School, and just like all the other victims, had her whole life ahead of her. And that's where we stand as of this recording in January of 2024. Richard Cottingham has confessed to the murders of 16 women. He is claimed to have murdered as many as 80 to 100. It seems like that could potentially be an actual real thing. I mean, some of these victims were pretty close together in their attacks, and if he's to be believed, he was killing someone about once every month. A lot of his victims, not all of them, were sex workers. He chose them because they were vulnerable. He chose them because they were easy prey. And, you know, we talked about in an earlier episode that the culture of the times around sex work, I mean, it's still not great. It's still considered a crime in many areas across the country, but sex work has been around forever. It's not new, but it's often something that, you know, crimes against sex workers are often overlooked. We know human trafficking is a very real thing. It's very underreported because of fear and the danger to the victims. Yeah. So if he was truly killing a person a month, then taking sex workers as his victims. It's very real that there are more victims out there that we will probably never be able to connect to him. I feel like I'm totally botching this, but we talked about in, an earlier episode that the police in this time frame in New York City had started using an acronym, NHI, no human involved in the deaths of sex workers that were found around New York City. So how many of those victims could have been victims of Richard Cottingham? It's truly scary. It's truly heartbreaking to even think about, because these are people. And as hard as these cases are to sometimes research, as hard as they are to talk about, I think it is important to talk about them, because if we don't talk about them and we don't remember the victims, then it's truly the killers that win. I didn't start this podcast to highlight the killers. I started it to bring light to the victims and remember the victims. And I truly hope that I am doing justice in talking to them and doing it in a manner that, I don't know what I'm trying to say, I guess memorializes them in a positive light. Yeah, that's what I got. So I just want to, again, give a shout out to a couple of resources. We've talked about some very, very dark topics, and I don't know who's listening out there. I continue to be very graciously humbled with the continued audience for this podcast. I never thought that it would reach the audience that it has. I thought maybe I'd have like 5 people listening, but we have more than that and continue to grow. But if there is somebody out there that is, struggling in a situation of human trafficking or sexual assault or abuse, you are not alone. There are resources out there, and I'm going to highlight 2 that we've talked about in the last 2 episodes. The first one is the Polaris Project. The Polaris Project runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and they're doing a lot of work out there to provide education, resources, and hope for victims of human trafficking. So if you or someone needs help, you can call 1-888-373-7888 or text Be Free to 233-733. And you can also go to polarisproject.org to find out about all of the work that they are doing, and just there's a wealth of information there about this horrible crime of human trafficking. We are continuing our fundraising campaign for the Polaris Project, so in the show notes you will find the link to take you to our fundraising campaign. Our other resource that I wanted to share is the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, or RAIN. They are the nation's largest anti-sexual violence resource and run the National Sexual Assault Hotline. So if you or someone has been a victim of sexual assault, again, you are not alone. You can call 1-800-656-4273 for, a safe place to talk about what has happened, for some help and support. You can download their mobile app, or visit www.rain, it's RAINN.org, for more information about that. To finish closing this out, I just want to give a couple other quick plugs, and then I will send you on your way for the week. Don't forget, you can follow our show on any of our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Please make sure you take a moment to just double check that you are following the show on your podcast platform of choice to make sure that you're getting updates on when new episodes drop. For next week, I have a very special guest host coming, and she is going to present a true crime case that has really been close to her heart for I think it's been 16 years since it occurred. So please come back next week and join us for that. I'm excited to have her for next week and hopefully for some additional guest appearances every now and again in the future. And don't forget that you can help support the show over on Patreon. We are on Patreon. I'm excited to announce that I will be hosting the first Dark Side Cocktail Hour live stream on Friday, March 1st at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I hope you'll join me for that. The proceeds from our Patreon go back to the show, and we're donating 50% to our current fundraising campaign with the Polaris Project. So if you're interested in donating in that way, that's awesome. Or you can continue to make additional contributions or help share a fundraising campaign. The link is available in the show notes and on our social medias and on the show's website at www.nydarksidepodcast.com. And I just greatly appreciate you. I think that's it. Yeah. So with that, I hope you have a great week ahead. I hope you keep listening, and I hope you stay curious.